So here we are. John, let's start by introducing ourselves.
Tier 1 counterterrorism pilot, worked with Delta NCL Team 6, and then I went off into the private sector. I worked as an analyst for Forrester, and then on to starting companies. And in the last 5-6 years, I've been writing about the future of warfare, how small autonomous groups of guerrillas can work as a cohesive whole to defeat larger foes. So that had applicability in Iraq and in Afghanistan and a lot of different places. And one of my areas of focus now is on the future of warfare as it's affected by drones and other types of technologies.
Well, cool. That's actually probably where our interests intersect, because I think we met after I wrote Demon. We were introduced by Rick Clow, because I think a lot of our thinking, of course, I'm a fiction author. I write tech thrillers, Demon, Freedom TM, and now Kill Decision. That's probably why we get along so well, because I think we have a lot of very similar feelings about both fourth generation warfare, resilient communities and stuff. Right. Kill Decision in particular being all about drones, specifically lethal autonomy. You were kind enough to be a military consultant or advisor on that. I really appreciate that.
It's my pleasure.
Oh, cool. Which is why we're sitting here today talking about drones, because you have a wealth of information about this. You've been examining this on your Global Guerrilla site for years, literally years. So you've been very much ahead of the curve, which is why you were so helpful. But also, I wanted to pick your brain a bit about some of the questions that I really wasn't able to cover in the book.
Okay.
Because a lot of people look at this stuff and they think, well, it's squarely in the realm of fiction. And that's why I was very glad when Chris Anderson said in Wired Magazine that my fiction is actually closer to reality than most people think. But that's why I think it would be beneficial to sit down with you today, because you are an expert on this type of stuff and in many different forms of conflict as well. Why don't we start? What I'll do is I'll make this a free-flowing conversation. I'll just toss out a question to you, which is, why is 2012 suddenly the year of the drone? What happened?
Well, drones have been advancing and improving for many years now. But just a couple years ago, we crossed an important threshold. The computational power on a relatively low-cost chip passed the intelligence equivalent of an insect. So now that we're past insect intelligence, which is essentially what's required to make a drone operate, and it's cheap, and it's something that you can put into a low-cost device. Drone tech magically appeared, and we're seeing it everywhere.
And insects have been known to cause human beings trouble.
Exactly. But it's going to keep on advancing, and so we're 2018, I think, according to Kurzweil and others, that we're going to pass the equivalence of rats. And so rat intelligence allows crawling and more ground-based drones and robots to appear. So we'll see those appear after that date.
Now, the international nature of this drone development is interesting to me. Once you're in a world where everybody has these things.
Right. I mean, the early big players were Israel and the U.S. And then China followed, and Russia's following. But this type of tech is available to anybody. I mean, to the hobbyist, like Chris Anderson at Wired, and his efforts to bring DIY drones, to the forefront. So it's little wonder that we're going to see 50. Every nation's pretty much going to get involved. Police departments are getting involved. It really doesn't take much to put together a drone that could be lethal or at least gather information. That's something that no one's really talked about, is this idea that we launched 2 arms races in the last 2 years. First is the drones. Okay, I mean, going from just surgical use of drones to wholesale use, where we're just putting them almost on constant orbit over Western Pakistan, over Afghanistan, over Yemen, over Philippines, and once they're in place, they will never go. I mean, as much as we withdraw from Afghanistan, those drones will never leave Afghanistan, and they likely never leave Western Pakistan either. So we've launched that, and then the other one was the use of Stuxnet and Flame, a computer virus, and to and they put it out on the open internet for everybody to see, for everybody
that
to
code
reverse
base is out
engineer.
there now. Yeah,
Exactly, and everybody in that space is reverse engineering that code, and that's usable stuff.
yeah. Well, yeah, it gathers the intelligence, and then it can monitor silently, and of course, it will be adapted, and it will continue to evolve through the effort of software engineers,
Yep.
hackers, and others, government and otherwise.
But we
And
did it twice. We were the first
yeah,
ones to shut down a factory, to do disruption, industrial sabotage using malware. The very thing that we talked about for years that was our vulnerability, we've inflicted and accelerated this stuff. We're the most vulnerable.
so it's the guy in the glass house throwing stones like crazy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just nuts.
Oh boy. Well,
And we did it without public debate or even any kind of, and it just kind of happened because it was easy. It was easier to do that than confront the hard issues associated with Iran having a nuke. It was easier to get into drones than confront the hard issues associated with, fighting, guerrilla war or, trying to stabilize Afghanistan. If those were impossible, probably shouldn't have been there. There was a need to go after individuals, but there wasn't a legal mechanism to actually do that. So what happened is we outsourced a lot of the decision making to black ops groups that were civilian, and they actually made the decisions that, based on general recommendations of who to kill and who not to kill, and that allowed the bureaucrats inside the big organizations to wash their hands and say, claim full deniability. So we had, this technology allows us to do that in a more large-scale way.
So the lethal autonomy, as opposed to the remote control. So lethal autonomy allows that distance from the action that's being taken. Is that
right? It gives you bureaucratic armor, posterior armor. You initiated something. If something goes wrong, it was a system.
Or the operators or the people who bought the system. It's basically you can start.
Or you can deny it. I mean, if there's nobody in the loop, or very few people in the decision-making loop, there's not really any witnesses to the fact that it went wrong.
So it's
okay. There's nobody to testify at a closed door, trial.
Firmware would be testifying.
Right, or if that's wiped, it's not there.
Yeah, interesting. So it's like cyber espionage or cyber war in the attribution sense. That attribution is very difficult.
Well, it gets murky, and it allows autonomous programs. I mean, after 9/11, there were plethora of programs that just got launched. I mean, lots and lots and lots of black programs doing all sorts of different things. And they all had, the get out of jail free card and the carte blanche to go do anything they wanted. And these kind of programs, would benefit mightily from owning a couple drones.
Yeah.
Like for instance, right now there's 3 different kill lists being run in the U.S. government. There's one being run by the U.S. Air Force. There's one being run by JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, and then there's one being run by the CIA. Each list is, people that have been targeted for assassination, and they've been given the green light to go do so.
Wow.
You can see these lists as they become automated and become more tied into the drones themselves. You get this like automated kill system.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We could definitely get started on that. I thought about that long and hard, and those are the 3 kill lists we know about. I mean,
correct.
And of course, there could be kill lists in other countries. No doubt there are. So that's one of the things that I was really looking at, and what interests me in a fiction sense, and what why I really value your input on it, is the concept of how you conduct war. It used to be that human conflict required buy-in by other humans, and the problem here being that if you look at all the carnage that had to be employed in order to defeat an enemy in the past, everything from carpet bombing, destroying their infrastructure. But if you combine that sort of pinpoint precision of identifying key figures and targeting them, then suddenly the size component goes out of human conflict to some degree. And you can hit key people before they become a problem or what have you.
Right.
And again, it's the secretive nature of it that concerned me. What does the world look like if a bunch of countries, and even non-state groups, are doing this?
Well, I mean, large-scale conventional warfare went out with the nuclear bomb. I mean, it was starting a process of being phased out because, I mean, you couldn't have war between superpowers, and you're not going to have a war between the U.S. and China, despite all the the planning and spending that we've been doing to make that possible. It's just not going to happen.
It's bad for business.
If you have a war between the U.S. and China or U.S. and Russia, the world ends. And that seems to be the as true today as it was in the 1950s. What we're also finding is that conventional war doesn't really occur. Large-scale conventional war is becoming rarer and less frequent because there's very few countries that have conventional militaries that we can attack and fight. And there were a couple requirements for us to have a conventional war over the last couple decades, and there were that they had a conventional military they were relatively disconnected from the global marketplace. And they didn't have nuclear weapons. And if the few countries that actually fell into that camp were Iraq and Iran, and then North Korea came out of that zone because of the development of nuclear weapons. So the only country left is Iran, and Iran is proving too connected to the global economy to attack. So there really isn't a country left that we can have a conventional war with.
That's interesting, and it does seem like these big set battles where you have hundreds of tanks and divisions of troops going at each other. You're right; it just doesn't seem to happen so much anymore.
If there was a war possible, we'd find a way to actually demonstrate the weapons. I mean, to a certain extent, the first Gulf War was a demonstration that we had this capability. But after that, we're going towards a world that's one big marketplace. Nation states are just part of that big marketplace. Nation states have their own, economic interests that they are, to a greater or lesser extent, advancing because of using their weapons and using their military capacity. Very much like how Russia is using its conventional military capacity to advance its oil and gas empire. I mean, it's all the big conflicts they had with Georgia and Estonia and everything else, everywhere else, are all oil and gas related. And one of the easiest ways to advance those economic interests is to use drones. It allows a world where you have hundreds of thousands and then eventually millions of drones, operating in all over the place, looking for targets of opportunity. Individuals that they find, or some economic interest finds to be a threat.
Well, it's interesting because in this sense, drones would then be able to conduct war without disrupting things. So, in other words, war would then become sort of like a background noise. Low intensity conflicts that don't disrupt the overall system would be the future then. Correct.
I mean, nations get penalized for warfare. They get hammered in the marketplaces if they get too bellicose, and it's bad for business.
Yeah.
And so as a result, we're seeing less and less of that. It's only in we're focusing more on these individuals that we find to be problems that need to be eliminated.
There is a weapon system. There is a weapon system that's perfect for that. Then,
correct.
What we're talking about, drones.
Yeah, and all this face recognition technology and everything else is moving right into that. So, and electronic signatures, right? Yep. I mean, the signature, right? There's a overarching signature that this person is a terrorist. It is currently being used in say places like Afghanistan and Pakistan and in Yemen and the Philippines. That could be as simple as 5 guys are identified in a forest with weapons. Therefore, 5 guys with weapons are now labeled terrorists or labeled for just assassination or just killing.
Well, it's funny because the systems guy that I am says that there would have to be some sort of numeric score for that signature. So
correct.
You might have a credit score now, but eventually you'll have a target score, and you want that one to be very low.
Right. Yeah, and that's where we're going towards. Is this administrative right now? The process of identifying people as enemy combatants, even Americans, and stripping them of due process in their citizenship is an administrative process. Mm. It's a portfolio review. It's not a judicial process. And administrative processes with 3 different kill lists plus lots of little groups operating with their own kill lists inside the U.S. government, the biggest player on the block right now, lends itself to imagining a future where you get this completely automated system, where you get 100,000 people or 200,000 or a couple million people on around the world that are on these kill lists, and that you're constantly looking for electronic signatures. That where somebody's purchasing something that triggers an electronic signature that or that this person is electronic fingerprint that identifies where they're at and who they are, and that connects to a dossier, and that dossier says, okay, this person has been authorized to kill or assassinate, and the drone that's in stationary station keeping comes down and wipes them out as they exit the store or as they drive. Part of this automation process is trying to speed up the kill.
Yeah.
So if you're going after a couple individuals, they're flagged. The drones are in the area. They dispatch to target, and then they do the deed. And then
It's interesting because again, it's not so much an attack on a nation state. So when nation states go after each other, of course, they have an immediate response, or at least some diplomatic response, something.
Right.
But when we're talking about individuals who might be troublesome locally as well to the people in power,
right.
It makes war a very different type of thing. It's almost like when and not to sound so crass, but when the body count doesn't reach a certain level, it doesn't
right.
reach a level of newsworthiness to some degree, sadly.
Exactly.
And so it can constantly be simmering in the background.
Do you know of any nation now that's really concerned, where the government is really concerned about the welfare of every single citizen?
Yeah, boy, that's going to be tough to find.
That's hard.
Yeah. I know people would say, well, when you're in a leadership position and you're dealing with millions and millions of people, tough decisions have to be made. I know
right.
that. But you're right. It does seem that that common defense. Well, I suppose this is as old as you could go back to Rome, and I'm sure these very cruel decisions are made that say, well, for the greater good, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. I guess the thing that really concerns me is, again, this sort of unseen decision-making, this lack of accountability, because in hindsight, people can spin things any way they want. That's
right.
why you want to have checks and balances. With drones proliferating around the world, many nations developing them, non-station groups, private security companies. How do we rein this in? What sort of, how do you fold this into some sort of legal framework like we've had in the past for conflict? There have been rules of war, Geneva Conventions. Right. What do we do about this if this is so radically changing the face of human conflict?
I don't think there's going to be any change. The Geneva Conventions occurred after, a Great War.
Yeah, World War I and then World War II.
Yeah. There was a response, and we don't have that. And given our inability to come to agreement on all the big issues that are occurring right now, on the financial problems, on the environmental problems, if we can't agree on those, we're not going to agree on drones and other things.
And I imagine there'll be those things you just mentioned: environmental resources, access to resources, changing climate, making that difficult, financial problems. They will probably only exacerbate the temptation to use drones as a foreign policy tool.
Oh, most definitely. Yep.
But isn't it funny? You look at some of the big issues of the past: biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons. These were world killers. These were going to kill us all. I grew up in the Cold War, and I remember them being looming threats, and yet we did create international treaties on them, and we did, so far, avoid using them and destroying the human race. And it's funny that this this smaller technology that's much more personal, I'm starting to agree with you that it's unlikely to completely stop. But I'm hopeful that we could come to some sort of international agreement about their use, if only for this reason, that the most likely targets of them would be international leaders, I would think. and that might spur them to come to some international agreement. I don't know how effective it would be, at least initially. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think I'm in error?
I think there's going to be some attempt to kind of control the private use of drones. I don't think there's going to be any kind of general agreement on how to use them in warfare and at the nation state level.
Oh wow!
This is more about going to be sold as an internal control tool initially, and that there are applications that to apply where you can apply them internationally. They're so effective in terms of projecting force. I mean, the whole U.S. strategy now is withdraw troops globally and start to build these mini bases or rapid deployment bases that you can move to anywhere in the world. And all it takes is some fuel, a couple guys, and a container full of drones.
Yeah.
And you're launching
some data. And some data on human movement and who are the hubs of social networks and things like that.
Yeah, a couple satellite uplinks and you got it all, and you got a base and a lethal base. In any location, and everybody wants that. Everyone wants that capability, even the small countries, because they can afford that. There's also the application of drones in non-lethal activities. I mean, just standard surveillance and non-lethal weapons for crowd containment. I ran a little scenario about Occupy never would have happened 5 years from now. 5 years from now, you will have drones with non-lethal weapons, including everything from the high frequency audio weapon that they use. I had that tested on me once, and it knocked me over.
Oh boy! Well, see, that's the funny thing, because of course it leaves no marks. It's very difficult to prove it was used.
And they have the heat weapons, and they have all sorts of other things. Goo for the to slow people down and other things. If an Occupy movement tried to set up a zone, they could quickly shut it down without even dispatching cops. Just basically, it looks like somebody's setting up. Boom, let's ping them. Send
or
them
from their purchase records or at Radio Shack, what they've been up to, building whatever. Interestingly enough, I've had conversations with people about, of course, the DIY community building a countervailing force of drones, but I don't know. I don't see that happening, only for this reason, that data component, that back-end component that allows you to look for those signatures, that's really the huge advantage. Some of the conversations I've had, again, people want to be very optimistic about this, and I certainly like to be, but putting together isolated drones that cannot be coordinated with a really good intelligence apparatus, you lose that surgical capability, and it just is not the same. It's not an equal footing, and this is one of the reasons why I'm really strongly encouraging the idea of some sort of legal framework here from the civilian side, some civilian oversight, and recent events really make that difficult for me to see how that's going to happen, at least in the near term. Again, you mentioned it, the great many successes, or at least perceived successes, that drones have had. And then, of course, those perceived successes, how they play internationally, how other nations are scrambling to invest in drones. And that, of course, puts further pressure for us to invest more in drones to keep up. And so it starts another arms race for this it could be very troubling, because as I look at this, it has the potential to have a corrosive effect on representative government. This idea that this would exist outside the purview of civilian oversight.
Why not a company?
Yeah, exactly.
There's lots of companies that hire mercenaries to go after, infringers, people who are infringing on their brand.
Yeah.
Why not use drones too? I mean, to augment that. I mean, some of these guys, I've talked to a couple, out of Switzerland, and they go in with weapons.
Interesting. Some mega upload, he gets taken out by a
maybe not that high profile, but I mean, if somebody's infringing on a pharmaceutical brand, you can have guys with weapons turning up, Russians with Kalashnikovs turning up and saying, stop this production. Or if it's in Egypt or in other places, guys with clubs. So drones are, a simple way to even augment that. So companies too.
Drones really don't require a lot of buy-in from people. It's a very small group of people, and that's what makes it different. You can conduct conflict, really strategic level global conflict, without a whole bunch of people cooperating with you, which is the radical change from what's been required previously. You look at no matter which side people fall on in Iran-Contra, the idea is that in order to conduct a secret war, you had to tell a lot of people, you had to hire a lot of people. Now, not only do you not have to do that, but it's relatively cheap, and it may be a lot cheaper, or perceived to be cheaper, than actually doing things the right way. And so there's another incentive to do it. As you said, they didn't need the approval from anyone to actually do it. They could just do it.
Yeah, it also makes it possible for, it saves, colonels and generals from making the decision to send, special ops troops out. And presidents get involved in this, and there's a human risk. You don't want to risk their lives, and if they get captured, it's bad news. It can drag on for years. And it makes it easier to send a drone, to do the work, because you can avoid all of that. Typically, these guys are control freaks to a certain extent, and you always read about, and I've seen it in person too, is that where the general is involved in the operation in some way. He's trying to get in the plane with you, or he wants to get out on the ground in the worst way, and often he's on the radio, messing things up, trying to turn
left, turn right.
Yeah, micromanaging the whole situation because his crew's on the line. So by having a drone do the work, you can actually have that general or that even the president can actually be the one pushing the button if they want for high profile. I mean, how many guys wanted to be the guy that pressing the button for the Bin Laden takedown? I mean,
Well, interesting in that case that they did use a human strike team, which I think principally because it was the great exception to this prevailing trend, which is there were other political considerations involved, the need to get genetic evidence and so forth, and perception and whatnot. But how many times is that going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, getting genetic evidence may be easy in the not too distant future too, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you have a genetic Lancet drone, but anyway, hey, something just stuck me. Yep, he's the guy. Let's talk a bit about swarming drones, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
I look at this. Now, you were just mentioning, the drone can be sent. Right now, they're cheap, but still fairly expensive compared to what a swarming drone would be like, where you have drones that can be sent, numerous very cheap drones that are fairly stupid, insect-level intelligence, but it doesn't matter if they fail because there's plenty of them. And one of the things that interests me so much, again, about global guerrillas in the site is for years, there's been a lot of discussion about the technology that is being tested right now for this type of thing. This is not some purely science fiction element. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about what the state of the art is for swarming drones and where it might be headed.
Well, you saw recently that Boeing announced that they had developed some swarming tech and applied it to one of their drone systems. It was only two, and there's plenty of videos. From Carnegie and others, that have demonstrated swarming technology. Typically, it's in controlled environments, so that the drones don't get confused. But again, this is biomimicry. We're just basically taking lessons that already learned by insects and applying them to our systems. And when you copy something, it goes faster than trying to develop things whole cloth. And certainly the information tech and the control system theory is all there. It's just adapting it to this new environment. Basic theory's done. You explored that in your book, which was great. And I looked at that from my perspective, trying to figure out how guerrilla movements operated when there wasn't a central command. And for instance, in Iraq, there were 75 to 100 different groups operating at any given moment. It's very different from the way guerrilla war had operated in the past. In the past, it was one hierarchy. You had a political group at the top, and they managed the whole hierarchy all the way down. Well, in modern conflict in Iraq and on, there are many different groups with many different motivations. They're all autonomous. Operating without any central command, and if we figured out, where a group was, if we killed it, it was just one group. We never really got far in terms of collapsing the whole structure. And one of the ways that they communicated was through something called stigmergy, which is a, stigmergic communication is basically the kind of chemical trail left by ants and bees, telling other people or other drones in the swarm where food is, how to get to the food, how to traverse a given maze or complex situation. And the stigmergic communication that these guerrillas were using were coming out of the news.
Interesting. So if stigmergy is modifying the environment to leave a trail or some information, the news cycle was their stigmergic propagation element.
Oh yeah, that's because that was so cool about the Damon was using in your first book was using exactly that to try to trigger news events triggered actions.
Yeah.
And in guerrilla warfare, what we saw is a news event, like an attack. You would do something. You would demonstrate a new process, a new type of attack, a new type of target, and that would be covered in the news cycle. And the success of that would be covered in the news cycle. It would then propagate out to the 100 different groups out there, and then they would often copy the type of attack, copy the technology, and copy the target.
Yeah.
And do the same thing, next week or the week after, and then there was a snowballing effect. That occurred, and that target was saturated with different types of attacks.
Yeah, variations on that attack.
Variations on that attack, and all due to that initial kind of event, and that trail that was left for the other groups.
Well, see, then for drones, like swarming drones, the idea is very similar, but in a smaller context. Let's say on that bit of terrain where the conflict is being fought, or the intruder is being attacked, they would detect a target, and then they would try numerous solutions to try to get rid of the target, and failure would then be communicated through the rest of the hive, if you will, and they would eventually happen upon, like you social insects do, a solution that works, and then they would reinforce that trail, sort of like upvoting things on Reddit.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's how the swarm would work. And I don't know, I think we're going to start seeing this within the next few years. Again, it's because it's so cheap, and failure is a given. Insects, they routinely lose members, but it's not really a problem.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's swarm armies or swarm forces. I mean, granted, we're not going to have full-scale conventional conflict because of the nuclear umbrella that's still out there, but full-scale swarm armies will quickly outpace the capacity of human-based armies. Yeah, I mean it's just inevitable. I mean, just looking from look at the way a drone flies versus a human flying a plane. I mean, a drone can take 25 Gs.
Yeah. And
turn on a dime, and it's if it's autonomous, it's very inexpensive, and a human being can only take 13 in a pinch just by varying it, going down a little bit. And you don't need a cockpit, you don't need controls, life support systems. Exactly. Yeah, and you don't need all that training and that lag time, and there's only so much information a pilot can absorb. Yeah. And you're looking only in one direction at any given time. Well, plus you can replicate that successful drone by simply manufacturing it. You can't manufacture fighter pilots. I mean, it's millions of dollars that are invested in terms of training into every fighter pilot. Yeah, and look at all the big engagements, the big wars that occurred, where you had the very expensive, high quality plane with a very high quality pilot up against, thousands of lower quality planes and lower quality opponents. I mean, the Russian airspace during World War II, classic example, and the Russians beat them. It swept the skies of German fighters over time, and there were some fighter aces and German fighter aces that got up to 350 plus kills. Good Lord. And just amazing numbers, but 6 months of training or 2 months of training, and up goes another Russian pilot. One interesting thing that I read on your site, and I'm trying to remember where it was, but this idea that if you had swarming drones, let's see, these smaller drones, doing area deniability, denying an area to an opponent, perpetuating themselves, using the infrastructure of an opponent to keep themselves sustained. I thought that was fascinating. And again, just the idea of these insect-like drones hanging from power lines in various places seemed particularly creepy. But yeah, that's the big challenge of our century. I mean, we have what I call self-replicating weapon systems. And there's 3 of them. One we've been a little bit exposed to, the biowarfare and germs that can kill people. The last time it really was used effectively was when the Mongols tossed a plague-ridden corpse into Odessa, or it was a colony of the Genoese in the Crimea, as just part of standard warfare. And the Genoese brought it back to Europe, and the Great Black Death occurred, and 100 million people died.
Wow.
Biowarfare, works.
That's a hell of a catapult shot. Yeah.
And now we're into a world of genetic manipulation, where genetic engineering is super simple, and the diseases that are created, the weapons that are created, can be created just by about anybody, and they can propagate in the environment, self-replicate, and make copies of themselves. Because self-replication means that the system itself can actually, make copies of itself and grow.
But it's interesting you say this, that I think there is a popular perception that that's a very dangerous thing. In other words, when you say viral infection, I think everybody's like, oh my God, that's a problem. You say swarming drones, I think people say, oh, cool.
Well, going forward with the self-replication is that with the drones, though, the worry for me is that you have these swarms of drones, and that they can self-fulfill. I mean, they can keep themselves, stocked with the materials they need to operate as a force for an indefinite period of time. Because what we're talking about as we look forward is, you have this in your book, is this idea this autonomous swarm can operate like a lethal machine of sorts, a lethal military force, and if it can go out and get its own energy, its own munitions, and just by attaching themselves to power lines like vampires, accessing stores of iron and other chemical materials, it becomes a very dangerous place, or just it's a very dangerous kind of scenario.
I have this image of a swarm of drones bringing their own 3D printers and setting down and plugging them in. Yeah,
3D printing is cheap.
Yeah.
And part of the whole, I suspect that we'll see this in the U.S. military pretty soon, is a part of this whole sustainment package for deployed drones will include 3D printers, including 3D printers that are flight mobile, and that are part of robotic systems. I mean, they already have 3D printers going, and a whole fabrication shops using the modern tech that makes fabrication so easy at the small scale. Available in trailers that go out with special ops teams, so they can deploy and make their own equipment.
I think I've seen photos of these. They're essentially they use the metal powder to make rare parts that might go bad, but they don't want to obviously stock them. So even though it's not cost effective, it is cost effective in the term of a critical operation where some sway bar or something goes out on a crucial truck, and so you print it essentially out of steel powder.
Yeah. Couple hours later, you have it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it will be even more cost effective over time. It's just because the tech is getting so cheap, so quick.
So if these drones can build themselves based on materials from an opponent's terrain,
right? You'd have gathering drones that would go out and grab the materials. They'd bring it back. They'd powder the materials, and then they would use the materials within the 3D printing process to build replacement parts and weaponry.
Interesting.
And then they use the power grid and other sources of fuel available to power themselves. There's even tech that will that operates on a muscle tech or a muscle-based system that will actually consume organic matter. If you really want to get creepy.
I saw this one too, and it caused a political storm at the time, and they said, "Well, no, we don't plan on eating the bodies on the battlefield."
Yeah, they're using muscles grown in sacks to actually be the actuator, to power the actuators, and then you feed the sacks a nutrient solution built, from biological matter that's gathered from anything like trees and small rodents and stuff like that. Just thrown in the
now it's sounding more like 2012.
That's way out. But swarming is a wild thing. I mean, long-term futures, 15 years out, possibility, what, 1 million drones, mass-produced, pacifying a mega city. I would have loved, to run a scenario and write a bit of fiction about what a massive swarming attack on a 30 million person city would look like.
Right, maybe
to pacify it, not to kill everybody, but to control it.
Well, that's it. Yeah.
There's a nuclear, or there's a self-replicating weapon here, like some computer virus that's very dangerous, or a biological weapon that's very dangerous, and we have to contain it. But we can't go into the city because it's a no-go zone.
Yeah.
We don't want to send people, so we shut it down. We contain everybody in their homes. They can't move until we bring in the team to do whatever we need to do. Or, it's possible with 1 million+ drones. It's a very scary future. It
could be. Again, it's that concentration of unaccountable power. That's the thing. And I guess if there's any recurring theme in my fiction, it's to some degree that it's those concentrations of unaccountable power, whether they be government, religious, corporations, you name it,
right.
Girl Scouts. That's where disruption occurs. And, it's all stories driven by conflict. So that's why as a tech thriller writer, it's very fertile ground for me. But when I talk to people like you, experts, it really is eye-opening because, again, these things are unfolding very rapidly. And without much commentary, and it's interesting. I think a lot of people see drones in the news, but I am surprised by how often I see drones in the news, but not in the context you and I are talking about. We'll see something about the use of drones for targeted assassinations, but not this very critical issue of lethal autonomy, about where things are heading rapidly. So I think this talk hopefully will contribute something to that. But to the extent that people generally start having a public discussion about that, I think it can only be for the better. I'm going to hit the kill button. Thanks to everybody for watching. Listen, take care, and I'll give you a buzz on the phone right after this. All right.
All right. Okay, take care. Bye.